It's kind of unfortunate that Adobe Illustrator doesn't have any dedicated grid or margin features, but there is a way around that. As you can see in front of you, I've created a relatively complex grid without dragging a whole bunch of guides out from the rulers on the sides. So I wanted to go over all of the techniques that I use to create this grid, and at the end of the video, I'll recreate it step by step. Before we do anything else, we'll want to adjust our guide preferences. You could do that by going up to Edit, Preferences, Guides, and Grid. You can see there aren't very many options for guides other than changing the color and changing between solid or dotted line. The easiest way to create guides is by dragging from the vertical or horizontal ruler. You can enable them with the shortcut Control or Command R. You can also go up to View, Rulers, Hide, or Show Rulers. Now that our rulers are enabled, with the Direct Selection tool, you can drag and drop from the horizontal and vertical rulers to place guides onto your workspace. Holding Shift while dragging these guides will allow them to snap to the nearest visible unit on the rulers. That means you can zoom in for more precise placement. Additionally, when dragging from either of these two rulers, you can hold Alt or Option to switch the direction of this guide. And of course, you can hold Alt or Option and Shift at the same time to toggle directions and enable snapping. The guides that you create using this method will span the entire width and height of your document workspace. So if I zoom all the way out here, you can see that in effect, if I want to create these guides within a specific artboard, let's say I don't want my guides bleeding over into other artboards, select the Artboard tool, which is Shift-O, and then repeat the same process that I described earlier, dragging from one of the rulers. You'll see that dotted line no longer spans the entire width of your screen, and just like before, you can hold Shift to snap it and Alt to change the direction. You may have noticed when clicking between artboards, the numbers on the rulers change, and that's because each artboard has its own coordinate system. You can switch to the global coordinate system by right-clicking on the ruler, change to global rulers. Then there's a specific origin point that will remain in place regardless of which artboard you have selected. Right now, it is up in the top left-hand corner of this artboard. If I want to change that global origin point, let's say I want that to be in the top left-hand corner of this artboard. Using the Direct Selection tool, hover over the intersection space between these two rulers and click and drag. Now this looks like you're going to be putting down a cross of two guides, but what it's actually doing is changing the origin point. So if I drag it to the top left-hand corner of this artboard and release, you'll see that the numbers changed here, and selecting different artboards does not change those numbers. If I change back to artboard rulers, we can adjust the origin point in the same way. However, it's going to be specific to each of those artboards. So I have this artboard selected right now. If I click and drag from the top left-hand corner to the bottom right-hand corner of the artboard, you'll see the origin point 0, 0 is now in the bottom right-hand corner. It doesn't need to be in the corner of your artboard. You can put the origin point wherever, but that is where it makes the most sense for most intents and purposes. You'll notice that when I right-click on the rulers, you can change the units here as well, and selecting a new unit will change that for both rulers. Any linear guides that you create will snap to existing objects, paths, and points on your artboards. So if I go ahead and select the Rectangle tool and draw a square in the middle of my artboard, if I drag this guide down to the top of the square, you'll notice it's not actually snapping to anything just yet. But if I mouse over to the horizontal path or the points on either end of it, then it will snap. Snapping to paths will only work if Smart Guides is enabled. So if I go up to View and Disable Smart Guides, and then I try to drag a guide out to the right side of this square, my cursor is just passing through it without any sort of magenta indication. This artboard is kind of a mess right now, and let's say I just want to see the artwork below all of the guides I've created. To do that, I can go to View, Guides, and click Hide Guides. You can achieve the same thing by right-clicking on your workspace without anything selected and clicking Hide Guides, or by using the shortcut Control or Command semicolon. Right now, all of these guides can be selected and deleted, and this might be a problem if you're trying to select your artwork below these guides because you're going to select all of the guides as well. To avoid that, you can navigate to View, Guides, and Lock Guides. And now you'll notice if I try to select the square, I will only select the square and not any of the other guides. Just like the visibility, the guide lock state can be toggled by right-clicking on an empty area of the workspace and clicking Lock Guides, or by using the shortcut Control-Alt or Command-Option semicolon. If you look into your Layers panel a bit, let me open up this layer Guides too, you can see that all of my guides are listed alongside normal objects. The order of the guides in your layer does not matter because regardless they will be visible on top of all of your objects. One thing you might realize here is that each individual guide has its own visibility and lock state, just like normal objects do. Right now, my guides are locked, but none of these have locks next to them. If I were to lock all of these and hit Command Option semicolon to unlock guides, you can see that they still won't be selected if I drag over them. I can advise against changing the visibility or lock states of guides within the layer hierarchy because it can get very confusing once that starts interacting with the global visibility and lock settings. So now that my guides are unlocked, let me clean up this artboard a little bit. And the last thing I should mention is that these guides create snapping and alignment points for objects on your artboard. So if I go ahead and lock my guides and select my rectangle tool, I can redraw this square that I had in the middle of my artboard exactly by snapping to the intersection points of these guides. I can also draw from the individual guides themselves. And it's important to know that this feature will only work if Smart Guides is enabled. Now, the more exciting and flexible way to create guides is by converting an existing vector path into guides. So if I wanted to make a star-shaped guide for some reason, I can select my star tool, draw one out, and with that path selected, I can go up to View, Guides, and click Make Guides. This can also be achieved by clicking on your shape, right-clicking your workspace, and clicking Make Guides, and by using the shortcut Control or Command 5. The guides that we've created in this way share the same properties as the linear guides that we already talked about, so they can be locked and hidden, and you'll notice it also appears in the layer structure just like the other guides. If I wanted to retrieve this star that I've made into guides, I'll first want to unlock guides, select the guide, and then I can go to View, Guides, Release Guides. This can also be achieved by selecting your custom guides, right-clicking on a blank area of your workspace and clicking Release Guides, or by using the shortcut Control or Command, Alt or Option, and 5. And what's interesting about this is that all vector paths and objects will maintain their appearance seen down in the Appearance tab right here. I have 3 circles on this artboard, each with a different appearance. Now if I select all of these and go through the same process, View, Guides, Make Guides, you'll see that they all look the exact same in this state. And if I select all these guides again, go to View, Guides, Release Guides, you can see that they've all retained their original appearance. Now let me show you some practical applications for this technique. I mentioned earlier that Illustrator doesn't have any sort of margins feature, but we can get around that by selecting the rectangle tool and drawing a rectangle across the entire artboard. Then with that rectangle selected, navigate to Object, Path, and Offset Path. And what this tool does is offset the selected closed path by the specified value here. So if I wanted margins of, let's say, 1/2 inch, I can type in -0.5 inches in the offset field and go ahead and click OK. And you'll see it created a duplicate of the original shape, but offset inwards by 1/2 inch. So I can go ahead and delete that outer shape, select the inner shape, right-click on it, and click Make Guides. Unfortunately, there's no easy way to create margins of different values on each side, but you can get around this by selecting your guides and adjusting them in the Transform panel here. I'm going to release these rectangle guides now that I'm happy with my margins in order to create a document grid. To do that, you will select your shape, go to Object, Path, Split into Grid. This panel might look somewhat familiar to you if you've created grids in InDesign before. You have sections for the rows, columns, and then a couple of options at the bottom here. I'm going to check Preview so I can see what I'm doing. Say we want 8 rows. Go ahead and type in 8 here, and 6 columns. and we want the gutters, which define the space in between each of these cells, to be 1/4 of an inch. And you'll notice that there are a couple of other variables in each of these sections. One is height or width, and the other is total. Height or width is simply a way to adjust the size of the cells in those dimensions. So if I increase the height of the rows, you'll see my gutter value is shrinking down to 0. And if I go ahead and increase the width, the gutters will shrink down to 0 as well. And then total defines the entire width and height of your grid. Now, I think it's easier to define these values by creating a shape of a specific size beforehand, but if you really want to, you can adjust the size of your grid by using these variables. Once you're happy with the grid you've created, you might be tempted to check Add Guides, but instead of creating actual guides, what this does is create a whole bunch of paths with very thin strokes, and it doesn't seem to do it properly either because half of the guides are on the wrong artboard. So I'll go ahead and disable that and click OK. Now with our grid selected, I'll repeat the same process, go to View, Guides, and Make Guides. Now we have an artboard with the specified margins as well as a complete document grid. Now that I've gone over what should be everything you need to know about guides and probably more, let's review by recreating this grid and guides that I showed you at the beginning of the video. So we'll start by zooming in and taking a look at the positions of these outer guides here. For the vertical guides, it looks like we have one at 1 inch, one at 1.5 inches, and another at 17 inches. So I'm going to go ahead and select my artboard here. Since the ruler values didn't change when I selected this artboard, we know that global rulers are currently enabled. So I'll right click on the ruler and click Change to Artboard Rulers. And we can see that the rulers have updated and indicate that the origin point of this artboard is in the top left-hand corner. Now we can more reliably place our guides. We had one at 1 inch, one at 1.5 inches. I'm holding Shift and dragging to snap these into place, and another at 17 inches. Let's take a look at these horizontal guides here. It looks like these are contained within the artboard, so we know we have to place them using the artboard tool. We have one at 1 inch, one at 1.5 inches, and then another at 23 inches. So go ahead and place those there. I'm going to use the shortcut Shift-O to enable my artboard tool and zoom in so I can get more precise snapping. Drag one down to 1 inch, 1.5 inches, and the last one at 23 inches. All right, now that that's taken care of, we can move on to the internal grid. So before I do anything else, I should take a look at the grid dimensions here and see what kind of measurements we're going to be using. It looks like we have 6 columns and 8 rows. And if we zoom in here, I'm going to go ahead and use my rectangle tool to measure, draw a square here, and we can see by the little pop-up next to my cursor that this is 1/4 of an inch by 1/4 of an inch. So I'll go ahead and move over to my other artboard, and using the rectangle tool, I'll draw a rectangle contained within these guides here. With that selected, I'll go up to Object, Path, and Split into Grid. And we'll start by checking Preview. I'll increase the number of rows to 8. The number of columns to 6, and the gutter will be increased to 1/4 of an inch horizontally as well as 1/4 of an inch vertically. And once we're happy with that, we can click OK. And with those selected, we can right click and select Make Guides. Hopefully this video fulfilled all of your guide making needs. Hopefully you now have a pretty advanced understanding of the things you can do with guides in this program. If you do have any questions or problems while you're making guides in the future, feel free to leave a comment on this video and I'd be happy to address it to the best of my ability. But regardless, thanks for sticking around through the entire video and I hope you learned something. Thanks for watching.